Hey everyone, welcome to Bite of the Week, your weekly digest for all news, tech related and otherwise. Inevitably, SpaceX is back in the news with more good stuff. You just gotta love SpaceX. Just every week, in a world where a lot of weird and negative stuff is going on, SpaceX is bringing us the Star Trek future that we've always been hoping for. And this week, they announced that they're going to be sending two people on a trip around the moon next year. Not in 10 years, not in 50 years, next year. And the people have already been selected. Well, they didn't just luck their way into it. It was actually pretty pricey. Apparently, not many details have come out yet, but it is happening and it's happening very soon. So expect presumably more news from them in the near future as well. One of my favorite stories from this past week, and it's also speaking of the Star Trek future that we've always wanted and hoped for. There's a company called BHEX, which just raised $1 million for 3D printed food. So look out for replicators in your perhaps distant future, but a foreseeable future. I'll have a link in the description below, of course. It's just astonishing technology, and basically what they've been able to do so far is make pizzas on demand, and it's just surreal to watch. It There's just arms and nozzles, and it shoots out dough and it shoots out sauce, and it cooks it right there in front of your eyes. It takes about 5 minutes, and it's something that has to be seen to be believed. The makers of the BHEX brought it to a food convention and had people try it, and apparently it got really good reviews. So I'm definitely looking forward to eating some 3D printed food at some point in, well, I hope it's sooner than later, but it seems like it'd still be a while out before it becomes mainstream. We'll see though. One of the more dramatic things that happened this week, and this was something that affected my own company, the storage service of Amazon, which is called S3, it went down, and it was so there was no like external hacking or anything like that. But basically, what happened is one of the system administrators typed in a command incorrectly, or maybe didn't type it in incorrectly, but was just misinformed about the scope of the consequences of what that command was. And what was intended was to take a few servers offline for a routine task, but what happened instead was it took a whole bunch of servers offline. And because AWS in general and S3 in particular is a backbone for a pretty large chunk of the internet, the result was that a lot of the internet itself went down. And this happened for the majority of a day, it seems like, as people were trying to, as the Amazon staff were trying to spin up their servers. It was really crazy, and it was interesting to see the repercussions for that from various companies. One company that I helped out, their site was just down in its entirety. My current company stores images on S3, but because we also have a redundancy in, like, we use a cache for images as well, even though technically the image server was down, that wasn't noticed by the vast majority of people because most people were still being served images through the cache, which was still up. But it was, some companies have that redundancy in place, some don't. And it's sort of like, if you have that backup, you were probably okay. If you didn't have that backup, then you were kind of in trouble. Ironically, one of the companies that was not prepared for this, although it does make sense, was Amazon itself. They rely very heavily on their own infrastructure, and that just makes sense. The funny use case that people pointed out was that a status monitor for S3 is itself hosted on S3. And so the progress bar was just saying S3 is working well. And that's because it hadn't been updated by the server that it's supposed to be monitoring. So there was sort of this like miscommunication, if you will, and that was just kind of funny. It was an unfortunate day for Amazon and for the internet, but I think no lasting repercussions happened. But sort of like the Cloud Bleed incident from last week, it was sort of a reminder to like be responsible and to, in this case, so last week was don't reuse passwords, use a password manager, and so on. This week's lesson was have a backup plan so that if your whole website is in one place and that place goes down, then you're in trouble. So have it in a couple places and you'll be fine. Now, AWS advertises a 99.9% uptime, and they've been very quick to point out that they are still above 99.9% by far. And that's a good point. It's very true. I think that like most people would not hold it against them that this incident happened. I think that AWS is otherwise an extremely solid service and a really good service to companies that take advantage of that infrastructure. So a bad day for Amazon, but just a day. Probably the biggest piece of news to come out this week was Snap Incorporated, which is the parent company of Snapchat, had its initial public offering. It is now trading under the symbol SNAP, if you could believe that. It's trading under the symbol Snap. Now they've finally, the company that makes Snapchat has grown to the point where they're ready to be out into the world. And that is, I imagine this will probably be the biggest tech IPO of the year, and one hotly anticipated for quite a long time. So it's a question now of like what comes next for them. On the downside, they've obviously been losing a lot of users to Instagram stories. Snapchat has always been sort of this like kind of competitor to Facebook, to Instagram, to other social media sites in general, and they've carved out a particular niche up to this point in the like 10-second videos or the ephemeral messaging space. But that's clearly not enough anymore because Instagram stories sort of came in, made the exact same product, but they already also have the hundreds of millions or however many users they have. Now just they have that many users that do the exact same thing that Snapchat does, but you don't have to leave Instagram and you don't have to leave, from a business perspective, you're not leaving the Facebook ecosystem. It'll be interesting to see how Snapchat and what they do to differentiate themselves in the future. I think they've been very smart in marketing. So for example, with the launch of the Spectacle, it was very unique amongst hardware releases. Typically when something like that comes out, iPhones, Google Glass, hardware in general typically gets sent to tech bloggers, to news sites, to have them do an early review to basically allow the company to get not only feedback from like the people who would be power users, but also to get publicity for that, so that when it gets released, it'll be there. The whole world will already like know what they're doing, or will already have some knowledge of the product. When Snapchat released Spectacles, they just had a single vending machine out in LA, and it was just like, if you want this, you can stand in line for it and you can get it. And that was a really creative way to draw up a lot of hype to create this artificial demand, and it worked really well for them. The Spectacles sold out every few hours from what I understand, and they had to keep coming back and refilling the machine. Now, how effective will that be in the long term as they continue to move away from the branding of like Snapchat is a 10-second video service, it's an ephemeral messaging service, to Snap Incorporated is a camera company. It is a purveyor of fashion accessories that facilitate communication with your friends, things like that. And as I was thinking about that, I was thinking, to be competitive in the space that they're in, they can't be another Facebook They can't beat Facebook by being another Facebook. They can't beat Instagram by being another Instagram. They have to carve out a section and like make it their own. And that's, I think, why they chose to go into hardware, because that's something that Instagram isn't doing at all, and Facebook is doing, but in a totally different area with Oculus. And so I think that being a combination of hardware and software is going to be what helps them be competitive in an already pretty saturated space. So that's all for this week. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all next week.